How strong is the Galactic Federation? For a long while I've wanted to answer that question for many of Metroid's greatest factions, and to see how they'd fare against sci-fi's other premier factions and galactic governments like the UNSC from Halo or the Galactic Empire from Star Wars, just to name a few. Today's the day that we have a look at the strengths, weaknesses, structure, and time periods related to the supposedly peaceful Galactic Federation. This is an experimental video, so if you enjoy this type of content, be sure to like and comment and subscribe to let me know that you want to see more of this content in the future. Without further ado, let's begin. Let's start with a brief overview of what the Galactic Federation is for those not in the know. The Galactic Federation, founded in year 2000 of the Cosmic Calendar, is the most powerful of the Metroid governments, alongside its rivals the Space Pirates and the Kraken Empire. It, as its name implies, is a united federation of semi-autonomous star systems and planets that collectively form the centralized government. I do say semi-autonomous, as well as the Federation seems to have power to conduct large-scale operations across its territory, like mobilizing for war or funding extensive research projects into uninhabitable worlds. It does also clearly rely heavily on the Federation police force as well as bounty hunters to maintain law and order in its furthest reaches of its territory. Also, it seems member states can be involved in wars without the larger Federation being involved, as we see in the plot thread with the Dominion in the manga, who intentionally start wars to sell their weapons. Despite the limited reach of the centralized government in some cases, the Federation, for most of the Metroid timeline, boasts a powerful military capable of operating across its territory, with even some planets, like the terraformed Norian, being dedicated to military outposting. This is just the very basics of the Federation, and more will be discussed later into the video, of course. So, for now, let's talk about the armed forces. The Galactic Federation as a basic entity, not discussing forces that are dependent on what part of the timeline you're talking about, have three consistent militarized forces. The Federation Police, who are in charge of dealing with crime on a planet-by-planet level. The Federation Marines, who are effectively the Federation equivalent of the Navy in their primary military forces. And finally, the Space Hunters, who are a special group of bounty hunters who work exclusively for the Federation on jobs too questionable or too dangerous for the standard soldier. What's convenient is that when scaling these three groups, it's actually possible to use Samus as a reference point. Literal beginning of manga base suit Samus as a cop, along with her police pals Malk and Kreetz, were capable of taking down dozens of pre-DNA amped space pirates with ease. This same cop Samus is able to destroy these Chozo machines here with a casual punch pretty easily. This should be about wall level to small building level depending on the calc. And while there's a range there, what I can be more confident on is her scaling to the Federation Marines. The Federation Marines should have scaled to her post-time-skip zero-suit version of herself, as Adam Malkovich, her commanding officer, doesn't seem to think of her as any more powerful next to his other subordinates. The Federation Marine early bounty hunter Samus one-shots a bioweapon without even her full suit and tanked a crash to Zebes in her zero suit, the former of which Adam states his forces could have handled themselves, and the latter being town level by calc. So the Federation Marines should be town level, more or less. Meanwhile, space hunters like Rundis, Gandrada, and Gore all scaled to PED suit Samus and Prime 3, albeit Samus was clearly holding back as she wasn't trying to kill them as they were her friends and colleagues. The lowball for these hunters would be to scale them to her Prime Hunter self, who, excluding her fight with Guerrilla, which is highly circumstantial and none of the hunters scaled to, capped at planet level, as her power bombs are stated and shown to be planet busters. Therefore, you could argue that by Prime 3, she was holding back substantially as she wasn't, of course, trying to kill them. If you want to highball them, you could argue that Samus was putting, a considerable amount of effort in, and then you could use her Prime 2 feats to scale to them and put them in High Universal, given that Samus defeated both Emperor Ing and Dark Samus, the former who held open Dark Aether, and the latter who tanked the collapse of Dark Aether respectively. Regardless, the Galactic Federation would have planet-busting to universe-level bounty hunters, including Samus, at their beck and call. When discussing how strong the Federation is, you now have to take into account what time period you're looking at. I break it down into three distinct different time periods: the Pirate War era, which is between the prequel manga through Prime 1, the Phazon Crisis era from Prime Hunters to Metroid 2, and the Downfall era between Super Metroid and Metroid Dread. In each era, the Federation gains or loses certain resources. The Pirate War era is the easiest. They only really gain Zero Mission Samus, but not much more besides their baseline abilities and factions. Things get more interesting in the Phazon Crisis era, actually, as the Federation now gets the Prime 3 Space Hunters, as well as notable upgrades to their soldiers, such as the PED suits, aka the Phazon Enhancement Device suits, which boosts their soldiers' combat effectiveness. We also get Metroid 2 Samus, and arguably most importantly, they get the Federation Force, an elite group of Marines who got mech suits based off the design of Samus' own suit, which notably allowed them to, and I hate to say this, defeat Samus. Lastly, the Federation gets planets like the Pirate Homeworld and Aether as either occupied planets or new member worlds. That said, in discussions about ground combat, the Federation are massively buffed here. Finally, during the Downfall era, where the military was falling under corruption, Another M, and Fusion, they lose the Phazon but are given Metroids, all variants included, as well as the Zabizian Space Pirates, which they were cloning, given that they still have some on the BSL station despite the events of Other M. They also lose the Prime Era Space Hunters but get stronger versions of Samus, as well as new hunters like Bomad and Cutting Zegan, both of whom by the end of the manga fend off scores of Integra robots. One of these robots thrashed a weaker Samus earlier in the manga, and she needed a whole power amp just to beat it. They also get the Joey, who was able to at least help out Samus significantly near the end of the manga, but perhaps the most important thing they actually get in the Downfall era is the Emmy. These machines are physically capable of overpowering Gravity Suit Metroid Dread Samus, and far and away, aside from the Metroids, the most valuable thing the Federation has in its pocket. While it is true it can be hacked, it is also true that it took the Chozo to do the hacking, which says a lot about its quality. You could argue by this point Samus is more or less independent of the Federation, especially by Dread. They shouldn't get her, but I do see that point, but I'll leave it to the viewer to decide the argument. So why have we almost exclusively talked about their assets instead of their military prowess or space combat strategy? Well, unfortunately, that's where we have a major gap in our knowledge. We have a limited number of battles they've been in. In terms of Federation Navy in action, there's only 4 examples: the battle between Adam Malkovich and Ridley's pirate forces in the prequel manga, the space battle above Norian, where Dark Samus' forces go head-to-head against the Federation fleet, the space battle above Planet Phase, where the pirates make their last stand against the Federation task force, and the Federation space battle against the Greed Corps in the Samus and Joy manga. The only ground battle we see really is again the Battle of Norian. Unfortunately, from these examples, there isn't much to be gleaned about Federation tactics and strategy, aside from the fact that the Federation always seems to be tactically equal to, or occasionally inferior to, the space pirates, which could suggest they don't function well against opponents who use the stateless strategy like the pirates in terms of warfare, and they heavily rely on their shiny new gadgets, bioweapons, and bounty hunters to carry many missions. To be fair, however, whilst off-panel, it is true that they won the Pirate Federation War, which was some 11 years long, and Chairman Keaton claims that had dramatically reduced the size and power of the space pirates by the time of Metroid Zero Mission. But again, given it's off-panel, the only inference that we can make is that when fighting in an actual open and traditional war, they seem to do well, especially when you consider they were massively outnumbered by the space pirates, who consist of numerous whole species, all of which are named space pirates, while the Federation military is overwhelmingly just human. So how would this translate into a scenario where the Federation has to fight another sci-fi faction? Well, one advantage in their corner is Metroid as a series has some of the fastest ships in any sci-fi faction. traveling between galaxies in mere minutes. For reference, the jump between Hoth to Bespin in Star Wars took 2 whole months to complete. The average strength of their soldiers is also considerable, as they would have to scale to Metroid 1 Zero Suit Samus, who is town level by default. The big disadvantage in the Federation is that they are limited in the reach of their centralized government, which means a slower initial response, as well as an army that struggles against the stateless strategies of opponents who use it. What they lack in that department, they more than make up for in their backup options. Having Samus alone, especially during the Phazon Crisis and the Downfall era, can flatly win the war for the Federation, let alone the other space hunters they have in their employ. Along with their Metroid clones, the pirate clones, and the infamous Emmy robots, and even the Federation force being far more powerful than anything the Star Wars, Halo, and Star Trek armies can muster. Lastly, on the notion of size, the Federation is seemingly at a disadvantage, as they are shown repeatedly to still be exploring the reaches of their own galaxy. Whilst they do have several important city worlds and fortress worlds, the total number of known Federation worlds is a lot smaller than most sci-fi factions, save for possibly the UNSC and Halo. In my personal opinion, despite their small size, the Federation's strength, range of military options, and exceptional ship speeds mean that they will still pose a formidable threat against other notable sci-fi juggernauts, and I think it's high time we see the Federation added to sci-fi battle discussions. With that said, that's all the time I have for today. Let me know what you thought about this experimental video in the comments below. And until next time, be safe, be wise, and please pray for a true peace in space.